All right, folks, I just wanted to review a bit of stuff for our test on Frankenstein, which will start on Wednesday. Tuesday, we will do some Kahoot Quizlet type of stuff and maybe some just verbal quizzing. But I wanted to kind of go back over something that we talked about before we actually started the book, which is Gothic literature, which is an offshoot of Romanticism, which we've been in for quite a while now. Um, Actually, ever since Christmas, because when we came back, we watched the movie of Jane Eyre, and that was an example of romanticism. So this is just a very specific type of romanticism. And the reason that I'm on your canvas here is because if you go into your files, this is what you'll see. And if you go down to Gothic conventions, that's a keynote. We went over it, but I'm just going to do kind of a quick review of it. I don't know why my voice went up at the end there. It was very weird. Felt like a howler monkey or something. So this particular presentation is a little bit more about American literature, but it applies to both. So I'll just kind of point out where the differences would be between British and American literature. And hopefully this will just be sort of a review because we did talk about this earlier on before we started the book. I'm not going to go full screen with this. I'm just going to keep it this way. The first thing, so these are conventions that we see in Gothic literature, which means these are like themes or motifs that kind of crop up and that it's easy to recognize in Gothic literature. So the first one is the frontier or wilderness, and that is a lot more of an American thing than a British thing. I used the same presentation in my American Lit class, which is English 3, but it still applies in some ways. Like obviously with America, you have like the unexplored frontier and stuff, but it's still definitely applicable to British literature because there's always going to be unexplored territory. For instance, I don't know, the North Pole, that makes sense. That's literally the point of Walton's whole expedition, is to go into unexplored territory, which there's nothing known about it. The forest or the woods could be associated with evil, and that happens in all kinds of literature. Particularly, it happens, people gather in the woods to do things that they could not get away with in normal civilization. Do we see that at all in Frankenstein? Maybe not. Like I'm thinking about the movie, and I know y'all haven't watched it yet, but they do the what's their names? The DeLacy's. They sort of live in the woods actually. But anytime you're in like the frontier or wilderness, there's going to be like threats of the unknown, and also like just anything can pop out at you in the darkness. So dark versus light is a theme that we see in all kinds of stuff. This is not specific to Gothic literature by any stretch of the imagination, but it is prominent in Gothic literature. Dark equals bad and light equals good. I mean, literally in Star Wars, they call it the dark side because it's the evil side. Sometimes that sort of manifests in day versus night. Day is good, and that's when positive things happen, and night is when evil or illegal things happen. And there's also sort of a religious element with this because there's a lot of stuff in the Bible about like the darkness of sin, the blackness of sin, and like letting God's light shine over you and stuff like that. So there's definitely like some dark versus light in a religious sense. The double or doppelganger. This is a really fun one. It could be a twin or an alter ego of another character. You can kind of probably with Frankenstein, you could identify some element of like a double or doppelganger through the foils that we talked about, even if it's not exactly it's not like a double of Victor, but Walton, for instance, is going through a very similar situation to what Victor went through. He's trying to make a name for himself by doing something that's never been done before. He's letting his ambition get the best of him. He's got people telling him he doesn't need to do this, but he decides to do it anyway, at least until the end. So he could sort of be like a double or doppelganger. I think a couple of examples I gave y'all of this earlier on was the movie Mr. Brooks, starring Kevin Costner, which if you haven't seen it, it's fairly adult. There's like a lot of gore and violence and stuff, but I would recommend it. I think it's really good. And Kevin Costner plays a serial killer, but he doesn't like that he's a serial killer. And then William Hurt plays like a psychic projection of the side of him that enjoys killing. So like right after he's killed someone and he's like, oh no, this is the last time, I'm not going to do this anymore, the sort of other side of him will pop up and be like, yeah, you're definitely going to do it again. You know you love this. You know you have a taste for it. And the double or doppelganger doesn't always have to be human. Sorry.
Teachers, please pardon the interruption. A quick announcement from your student council.
Oh my gosh.
Next week is Spirit Week here at Allegro.
Okay.
By dressing up each day and
I'm going to pause.
For the Low Country Food Bank.
That announcement was ridiculous. Anyway, it can be a human. It can be like a ghostly or psychic projection, that kind of thing. Liminality. I love this concept. Liminality is when something exists at the recognized borders or boundaries of recognized existence. So in some sort of transitional space. Lots of things can be liminal. You can have liminal spaces. Graveyards are a good one because you go and visit them, but you're like visiting with dead people, and you could say that there are ghosts there who are like between life and death, whatever. More practically, doorways and windows are liminal spaces because are they part of the room? Are they part of the hall? Are they part of outside? Like, what are they? What is a window? Never thought you'd be asking such esoteric questions today. Liminal experiences, you have like that moment between sleeping and waking. We definitely see some of that in Frankenstein, like after Victor falls sick, right after he has created the monster, and he's like sort of hallucinating in his like fevered state. He keeps thinking he sees the monster. Being in that state where he's like not fully conscious but not unconscious, that's definitely a liminal experience. You guys are all in a liminal experience right now, just transitioning between childhood and adulthood. Most of you are legally adults at this point, but you still live with your parents. You don't pay most of your own bills. You're still in school. So all of this stuff that's like more associated with childhood, you haven't moved on from that yet. And then dying. Victor definitely lives a bit of a liminal existence at the end because he is actively dying for quite some time, but he's still alive and like giving speeches and stuff. And then you have liminal creatures. I would say the monster is definitely a liminal creature. He is literally made up of parts of dead bodies, but he is alive. Any undead creature as well would count. The uncanny, and this one is kind of hard to put your finger on sometimes. And they say, whoever they are, the powers that be, call this actually like in the place where the uncanny exists, we call it the uncanny valley. And that's when the familiar becomes unfamiliar in an unsettling way. An example would be like if you saw someone who looked exactly like you, like your twin. Not only would that be like the double/doppelganger, but that would be uncanny. If you don't know you have a twin, that would be a really eerie experience. One that I mentioned was in the movie Black Swan, which you don't need to have seen, but you've probably at least seen like trailers of it or something, when Natalie Portman's looking in the mirror and then she turns away from the mirror, but her reflection does not change and it smiles really creepily. And like we see our reflections all the time, but that's creepy and that's uncanny because that's not quite supposed to happen. Dolls and puppets that look like humans are another example. Degeneration, which is a downward spiral, either morally or physically. I think you could argue that Victor sort of degenerates in both ways, particularly when he is creating the monster, because he gets so focused and so obsessed with it that he can't do anything else. And he like basically starves himself and goes without sleeping, and really experiences a physical degeneration, but also his morals are questionable for sure. Throughout the book, his morals are questionable. Family is a big one, and I think you could probably see some stuff in this with family, particularly if we're talking about the monster as being sort of his son. That's definitely a family thing. The ways that this theme of family kind of manifests in Gothic literature, if you have people who pay for the sins of their families, like paying for their fathers or grandfathers' sins and stuff. Ooh, this is such a good thing in Southern Gothic literature, which is a very specific niche, but I love Southern Gothic literature. The repercussions of past actions echo across time, which is sort of the same thing as that first bullet point. Like you can't really escape the horrible things that your family has done, and that kind of ties in with the idea that true evil never dies. Oh, what show was that? Oh, there's this show called The Affair, and it's not a good show, and I don't recommend it. But this guy, like his son died when he was like 2 years old or something, and his dad had hanged himself when he was 10 years old, and they said that like there was a curse on the family because his dad had like, or his granddad maybe had done something terrible, and everyone in that line would have to pay for what he had done. And so like any baby that was born would have something terrible happen to them. No one would ever be happy. No one would ever be able to find love and fulfillment because they were paying for the sins of this grandfather. That's a good example. It's not necessarily Gothic in that case, but that's a Gothic idea. The depravity of man, which means that man is inherently evil. And I think, if anything, maybe Frankenstein sort of argues against this, because when the monster first comes into being, he's not evil. He is brand new like a baby, and he wants to be loved. He wants to find companionship. It's only after people are cruel to him that he decides to become a vindictive, terrible monster. But it also includes the idea that evil wins out in the end. And I think you could make the argument that it does. I mean, Victor doesn't really get revenge on this monster. But I guess that also brings up the question of who we think is the most evil in this book. The grotesque is a fun one, and definitely applicable to Frankenstein, because the monster is definitely an example of the grotesque. That would be like a mutation of characters, plants, or animals, or a transformation of normal features or behaviors that are extreme and usually frightening. Physically, he is definitely an example of the grotesque, because he is cobbled together from these parts of dead people and is very terrifying to look at. Sometimes it doesn't always have to be necessarily a physical thing, but it often is. And lastly, the idea of masks, which can either be actual physical masks or like a mask that you wear like on your personality. You've totally deceived people into thinking you're something that you're not. This actually makes me think of the movie The Orphan. If you guys haven't seen that, it is super freaky, and it's about like this little girl who gets adopted by a family, and then, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen this movie, at the end it turns out that she's actually like an old woman who just has like a weird disorder that makes her really small, but she just puts on like a disguise. She wears all this makeup and like fake teeth and stuff to make herself seem like a little girl. It's weird. It's so weird and creepy. But it's meant to hide her true self, and that's what masks do. We're trying to hide our true selves, sometimes to intensify the mystery of the character, sometimes to hide some kind of horrible flaw. And then the death veil is definitely a thing in Gothic literature. We don't really see that in Frankenstein, but oftentimes dead bodies would have like a veil over them to conceal their face. So those are all of our Gothic conventions. There may be a question or two about this on the test, but definitely I think that you can make some connections here with what we've seen in Frankenstein and these Gothic conventions, and you can see what a good example Frankenstein actually is of a Gothic work of literature, a work of Gothic literature. Okay, that's it. I will see you guys tomorrow to do some more review.